The last hope for Korrath. The distress call echoed through the void, bouncing off forgotten relay stations and abandoned deep space satellites before finally reaching the ears of humanity. This is High Scholar Valen of Korrath. Our world is dying. Our people are doomed. If anyone can hear this transmission, please help us. We do not have much time left. It was a plea carried across the vastness of space, a cry for help from a civilization that had once stood tall among the stars. Commander Ronan Vale sat in the command chair of the TSS Resolute, his expression unreadable as he listened to the message for the third time. The bridge crew remained silent, because they all knew what it meant. Korrath, a once thriving world of scholars, philosophers and engineers, was now facing certain doom. The planet's sun, Tarsus 6, was entering an accelerated collapse phase, something that shouldn't have happened for another few million years. In less than 5 months, it would go supernova, obliterating everything in its path. And the Korrathi, they weren't prepared. Not for an evacuation, not for survival. Their ships were ancient, their infrastructure in ruins, and their government paralyzed by indecision. They had waited too long to ask for help. And now, only 12 human ships stood between them and extinction. A doomed race, a desperate gamble. Vale leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. 12 ships, that was all he had. 12 Terran ships scattered across the sector, originally deployed for patrols, scientific expeditions, and diplomatic missions. They were not a rescue fleet. They were not an army. And yet, they were the only hope Korrath had. Drake, ever pragmatic, pulled up the latest planetary scans. The data was grim. The star's core collapse is already underway, she explained, pointing to a growing red blotch in the middle of the readout. Temperature fluctuations have already begun. Korrath's atmosphere will become uninhabitable within 3 months due to rising radiation levels. Vale clenched his jaw. And their evacuation plan? Drake shook her head. Non-existent. Their ships are centuries old, barely capable of sublight travel, let alone an interstellar exodus. They weren't ready for this, Commander. Vale exhaled slowly. This was a nightmare. They had to move an entire species off-world, a species that numbered over 20 million, and they had to do it in less than 5 months. With just 12 ships. The numbers didn't work. But then again, humanity had never been good at listening to numbers. Vale turned to Chief Engineer Dax Monroe, the only person who seemed to be enjoying himself in this mess. Dax, he said, how fast can we retrofit these ships into high-capacity transports? Monroe smirked. If you don't mind breaking a few safety regulations, I'd say a couple of weeks. Vale sighed. I don't care about regulations. I care about saving lives. Monroe's grin widened. Now that's a project I can get behind. The impossible plan. For the next 3 days, the Resolute's officers worked around the clock to develop a strategy. They examined every possible escape route, assessed every ship in their fleet, and considered every alternative to ensure the survival of Korrath's people. One thing became painfully clear. There was no way they could evacuate 20 million people with 12 ships. Not with normal methods. So, they had to get creative. If we can't carry them all, Vale reasoned, we build ships that can. Drake raised an eyebrow. With what materials? Vale pointed at the asteroid fields surrounding Korrath. There, we mine, strip, and repurpose every piece of salvageable material. We turn cargo ships into evacuation arcs. We build life support systems into freight haulers. If it can fly, we make it carry people. Drake gave a slow nod, her mind already racing through logistics. And what about the ones we can't get off-world in time? Vale's expression darkened. Then we build underground shelters, shielded against radiation and debris. We keep them alive long enough for a second wave of evacuations. The officers exchanged looks. It was insane. It was reckless. And it was humanity's best shot. The clock starts ticking. The next few weeks became a testament to human ingenuity. The asteroid belts became shipyards, turned into makeshift dry docks where human and Korrathi engineers worked together to build escape vessels. Mining rigs were converted into transports, haulers into lifeboats, and freighters into colony ships. What started as 12 ships quickly became 50, and they were still building more. The Korrathi, once skeptical of humanity's recklessness, now watched in awe. "You humans are mad, Commander," High Scholar Valen murmured, observing the frantic construction efforts. "You cannot possibly hope to save everyone." Vale's response was simple. "Watch us. A new threat emerges." But just as things were beginning to fall into place, a new danger reared its head. The Tarsus pirates had arrived. They were scavengers, preying on dying worlds, swooping in when civilizations were at their weakest to loot, plunder, and vanish into the stars. And now they had their eyes set on Korrath. Drake stormed onto the bridge, her face pale. "Commander, we have incoming. A pirate fleet, 20 ships strong. They know Korrath is vulnerable." Vale's fingers curled into fists. "How long until they reach orbit?" Drake's voice was tight. "Less than 2 days." Monroe swore under his breath. "We're stretched thin already. We can't fight a war and evacuate at the same time." Vale stood. His mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. "We don't fight them," he said. "We outsmart them." The officers turned to him in confusion. Monroe frowned. "I hate it when you say stuff like that." Vale smirked. "Drake, get me sensor data on the asteroid belt's largest formations. Monroe, how many thrusters and demolition charges do we have left?" Monroe blinked. Then his eyes widened. "You're not suggesting we..." Vale's grin turned wicked. "We make the asteroid field fight for us." Humanity's boldest move. The incoming pirate fleet cast a dark shadow over an already impossible mission. They had less than 2 days before a fleet of 20 ruthless scavenger ships reached Korrath's orbit, and while the humans had expanded their fleet from 12 to 50, these were not warships. They were repurposed cargo haulers, refitted mining vessels, and makeshift evacuation transports. Commander Ronan Vale stood at the center of the TSS Resolute's bridge, staring at the incoming threat on the holo display. "We can't afford to fight them," First Officer Lillian Drake said, arms crossed. "We barely have enough firepower to protect the evacuation efforts." Vale nodded. "That's why we won't fight them." Silence. Then, Chief Engineer Dax Monroe let out a long, knowing sigh. "I hate where this is going," he muttered. Vale smirked. "Drake, Monroe, how many gravitational thrusters and demolition charges do we have left?" Drake frowned. "Enough for controlled asteroid mining. But I have a feeling that's not what you're asking." Vale tapped the screen, enlarging the asteroid belt surrounding Korrath. "We can't take them on ship to ship, but we don't have to. If we play this right, we can turn the entire asteroid belt into a weapon." Monroe let out a low whistle. "You're talking about weaponizing planetary debris, moving entire asteroid fields into their path." Vale nodded. Drake leaned in, studying the data. "If we do this wrong, we could trap ourselves in orbit." "That's why we do it right," Vale countered. "If we can control the velocity and trajectory of these asteroids, we won't just blockade the pirates, we can crush them before they ever reach Korrath." Monroe chuckled, shaking his head. "Commander, you're insane." Vale grinned. "That's why it'll work." The asteroid trap. Within hours, the human engineers and Korrathi scientists worked together to turn nature into a weapon. Automated mining drones were reprogrammed to attach gravitational thrusters to the largest asteroids in the field. These colossal chunks of rock, some the size of entire city blocks, would be nudged into a controlled collision course, a wall of death, moving just slowly enough that the pirates wouldn't notice until it was too late. Monroe stood on the control deck of the TSS Vanguard, watching the drone feeds. "I've done a lot of reckless things in my time," he muttered. "But weaponizing a damn asteroid belt, This one's going in the record books. A nearby Korrathi scientist, Telek Van, folded his arms. Your species is terrifyingly resourceful, he admitted. You are willing to reshape the heavens to protect us. Monroe smirked. Buddy, we once nuked an asteroid heading for Earth just because it ruined our weekend plans. This is just another Tuesday. The pirates arrive. 2 days passed. The pirate fleet dropped out of FTL, emerging from the dark void like a swarm of locusts. Their ships, a mixture of stolen warships, retrofitted freighters, and attack frigates, were sleek, fast, and heavily armed. Vale and his officers watched from orbit, observing the enemy's approach. Here they come, Drake murmured. Vale exhaled. Hold steady. The pirate leader, a Korrathi warlord turned raider, Dorak Fall, sent a wideband transmission. Terrans, this planet is already lost. Stand down, and we may allow you to live. Vale smirked. Oh, we're standing down. But you should probably look at your sensors. Dorak's fleet approached the high-atmosphere blockade, unaware that hundreds of tons of rock were drifting toward them at high speed. Commander, Monroe called from the mining rig controls, initiating final push. The gravitational thrusters activated. A wall of debris, carefully nudged into motion, now accelerated toward the pirates at terminal velocity. By the time Dorak realized what was happening, it was too late. His fleet scrambled to react, but pirate ships weren't designed for planetary-scale debris maneuvers. They weren't built for asteroid storms. And this wasn't a storm. This was a hellfire hurricane. The battle without a battle. The first impact was brutal. A massive asteroid, moving at just under escape velocity, slammed into the lead pirate cruiser. The ship's shields flared, but it was too much energy, too fast. The hull crumpled, breaking apart as the vessel was ripped in half. Panic erupted among the pirate fleet. Ships attempted to scatter, but the entire asteroid field had been nudged into controlled chaos. One by one, pirate vessels collided with debris, their engines crippled, their hulls breached. Dorak's flagship, a heavily modified destroyer, managed to avoid the worst of the initial impacts, but as it veered away, its starboard engines were clipped by a fast-moving asteroid, sending it spinning uncontrollably. On the Resolute's bridge, Drake watched the destruction unfold. They're getting shredded. Vale nodded. Good. The pirates had come looking for easy prey. Instead, they had flown straight into a human-made death trap. Dorak's final transmission was a desperate, rage-filled scream before his ship vanished in a fiery explosion, consumed by the very debris his fleet had ignored. And just like that, the pirate threat was over. Aftermath. The true battle begins. The relief was short-lived. As the last pieces of debris settled into Korrath's upper atmosphere, Monroe turned to Vale. We bought ourselves time. But the real problem, still there. He was right. The supernova countdown hadn't stopped. The evacuation clock was still ticking. And despite their efforts, they were still short on ships. Vale exhaled. There was no way to get all 20 million Korrathi off-world in time. Unless... He turned to Drake. How much fuel do we have left? Drake frowned. Enough to keep the fleet moving, but not enough for long-haul FTL jumps. Vale thought for a long moment. Then we don't make a long-haul jump. Drake narrowed her eyes. What are you thinking? Vale's expression hardened. We don't have enough ships to save everyone. But what if we turned Korrath itself into a ship? Monroe froze, staring at him. Commander, did you just say what I think you said? Vale nodded. If we can't move the people off the planet in time, he said, then we move the planet itself. Silence. Then Monroe let out a low whistle. Commander, that might be the craziest idea you've ever had. Vale smirked. And that's why it's going to work. Moving mountains, moving worlds. The idea was insane. Move the planet. No one had ever attempted it. Not in recorded human history. Not even the most advanced civilizations of the galactic Concord had shifted an entire world from its orbit. And yet, as the Korrathi sun inched closer to supernova, as the remaining population of 20 million clung to the hope of salvation, Commander Ronan Vale knew there was no alternative. They were out of time, out of ships, and out of options. The only way to save Korrath was to move it. The plan that shouldn't work. The bridge of the TSS Resolute was eerily quiet as Vale laid out the idea. His officers sat in stunned silence, barely able to process the sheer audacity of it. "You're talking about using engines to push a planet," Chief Engineer Dax Monroe said slowly, as if he still wasn't sure whether to laugh or panic. Vale nodded. "Yes." Monroe sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sir, I can fix a warp drive with nothing but a chewing gum wrapper and a prayer, but this is lunacy." First Officer Lillian Drake stared at the holographic projection of Korrath. "We don't have the technology for planetary movement." "Hell, no one does. The gravitational forces alone would tear the crust apart." "Not if we do it right," Vale countered. He walked to the center of the holodable and tapped the projection, pulling up a model of Korrath's outer crust and mantle composition. "Look at this," he continued. "Korrath has an unusually thick mantle and a solid iron-nickel core. That means it can withstand more stress than Earth. We won't be able to move it fast, but if we create a stable push, we can shift its orbit just enough to break free from Tarsus 6's death zone." Silence. Monroe frowned. "We don't have engines big enough for that." Vale turned to him. "Not yet." Monroe narrowed his eyes. "Okay. Now I'm scared. Building the impossible. If they were going to move a planet, they needed engines powerful enough to push continents. And they needed a lot of them." Vale gathered the best engineers from both humanity and the Korrathi scientific elite, presenting them with a challenge that had never been attempted. "We're going to build a planetary propulsion system," he said. "We're going to use everything we have. Mining thrusters, gravitational boosters, atmospheric stabilizers, even asteroidal mass draggers, to create the biggest engine cluster in galactic history." The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Then a single Korrathi scientist, Eldar Kiev, stepped forward. "You are proposing we turn Korrath into a starship?" Vale nodded. "Yes." Kiev blinked. Then, slowly, his stoic expression cracked into a grin. "Then let's build a ship." The engine yards of Korrath. The next 2 weeks became a blur of frantic construction. The asteroid fields that had once been mined for evacuation ships were now stripped to the core, every ounce of metal repurposed into massive planetary engines. Mining lasers were converted into thermal stabilizers. Warp cores from broken ships were jury-rigged into pulse thrusters. Even the wreckage of the destroyed pirate fleet was cannibalized for usable components. Korrath itself became a shipyard, and the people. They worked day and night, Korrathi and humans together, welding, building, creating something that had never been done before. The power problem. Halfway through the process, Monroe stormed onto the bridge, covered in grease and absolutely furious. "Commander, I swear to every god in the universe, if you tell me to invent physics again, I'm going to throw myself into the nearest black hole." Vale smirked. "Problems." Monroe threw a datapad onto the table. "Yeah. Power. We don't have enough of it. Even with every reactor we've got, it's not enough to push a planet." Vale frowned. "How much more do we need?" Monroe exhaled. "A lot. We're talking black hole levels of energy." A long silence followed. Then Eldar Kiev cleared his throat. "There is one possibility." Everyone turned to him. The Korrathi scientist pulled up a projection of Tarsus 6, the dying sun. "If we cannot generate power," he said, "we must steal it." Vale raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we siphon energy from the sun?" Kiev nodded. "A solar energy harvester. We deploy a series of gravitational tethers, capture part of the sun's radiation, and redirect it into the planetary engines." Monroe's jaw dropped. You want to build a Dyson beam in 3 weeks? Kiev shrugged. Humans built an evacuation fleet in 1 month. You are good at impossible things. Monroe ran a hand down his face. I hate how much sense that makes. The countdown begins. The next 3 weeks were madness. The Dyson beam system was hastily built using repurposed solar collectors, turning the Tarsus 6 crisis into a power source. The planetary thrusters were activated in sequence, creating a shockwave of force beneath the planet's crust. Korrath shuddered as it fought against its own orbit, resisting the impossible. Then, slowly, the impossible happened. The orbital sensors on the Resolute detected a shift. 0 degrees. Then 0.002. Then 0.005. The planet was moving. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. But it was happening. Vale turned to Monroe. Status. Monroe, staring in disbelief at the readings, whispered, "It's working." The final hours. Tarsus 6 was on the brink of collapse. The star was boiling, shedding radiation at dangerous levels. The Korrathi watched in silent terror as the sky turned blood red, the sun's last moments stretching across the heavens. "We need more power," Monroe called. "We're almost there." Vale turned to Kiev. "How much more?" Kiev swallowed. "If we can push the engines one last time, we can break Korrath's orbital lock and drift free." Vale didn't hesitate. "Do it." Monroe slammed the final override. The planet shook, a deep, resonating quake that thundered across the continents. The thrusters fired at maximum output, fueled by the last reserves of the sun's stolen energy. For a moment, it felt like everything would break apart. Then, the alarm stopped. The shaking ceased. And outside the viewport, Tarsus 6 exploded, a supernova unlike anything seen before. And Korrath. Korrath was no longer there. It had moved, just far enough to escape.